I put it in my narrative, Reagan never stood up in front of the Federal Trade Commission and said, "Mr. Regulator, tear down this rule." Although he did have that attitude to a very large extent. And I tell a couple of stories of some of his closed-door meetings with Tip O'Neill, where Reagan at times used language that would have done Lyndon Johnson proud. So it had its own elements of drama now and then. I'll just sort of add to that. There were two frustrations that people in Washington had with Reagan. They would come to see him, and they'd have a half hour on the schedule. You know, they scheduled presidents very tightly. And they'd be up there wanting to get his help on trade, or or a lot of times people would want him to change his mind on taxes, even Republicans. And they would come out of the meeting after half an hour saying, "Darn that guy, all he would talk about is Hollywood stories to us." And I was amused when Ted Kennedy's memoir came out here a couple of weeks ago, and it repeated the story of going down to see Reagan in the second term, I think, wanting to get help with shoe imports that were hurting shoe manufacturers in this country. And Reagan talked about shoes the whole time, and he said Ted Kennedy's shoes were neat, and now where'd you get them, and all these sorts of things. And soon the aide came in and said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry, it's time for your next appointment." And Ted Kennedy says, that was what Reagan was like. He wasn't. So the legend grew up that Reagan was unserious about politics. This fed the legend that he was a creature of staff, and this was all an act. What people never understood and meditated on is that when Reagan was in Hollywood in the 40s, the rap on him was, Reagan is obsessed with politics. It's all he ever talks about. He's becoming a bore. He won't talk about anything else. So fast forward 30 years to Washington, and all these political pros on Capitol Hill would come out of these meetings saying, Reagan won't shut up about Hollywood. He won't talk to us about politics. Well, they didn't understand something, but they were being had every time. Calvin Coolidge used to say, most people who come into the Oval Office to see you are there trying to get something they ought not to have. And Coolidge's answer was, I find if I just sit very still like a cigar store Indian for about 3 minutes, people will give up and leave. And that's partly how he got the reputation as being silent cow, because if the President of the United States is sitting there not moving, you get very uncomfortable in a hurry. Well, Reagan was much too gregarious to do that. So rather than have fights with people, because it'd be unpleasant if you start a big fight every time about trade and taxes and all the rest, he would just tell them Hollywood stories, and then the aide would come in and say, I'm sorry, the time's up. There are lots of examples of where Reagan, in a meeting with someone, would tell the aide, I'm sorry, just push everything else back. I want to keep talking here with whoever was with him. At other times, in these meetings, the Reagan would say, I'm sorry, you guys, I just got to do what my schedulers tell me. Never figured out that they were being had by this wily guy every single time. But there were other times when Reagan did want to argue. Because the other thing that's interesting about those kinds of private meetings is most of the time in Washington, when you're going to have one of these meetings, or Reagan often went to Capitol Hill to meet Congress on their own home turf, is they want to cut a deal. That's what people do in Congress and in Washington. And Reagan was interested in a deal too, but he wanted to argue first. So some of these meetings with Tip O'Neill, they would argue about the New Deal, and it would drive Tip O'Neill out of his mind. So he did have an instinct for argument and wanted to fight about these things, even if it was not in front of the public. The other problems that in evaluating Reagan is that, like any practical politician, there are inconsistencies. For example, after the tax cut of 1981, Reagan agreed to a tax increase of some kind in some form every year after that. Much to the dismay of a lot of conservatives. They were usually small things, an excise tax on this, a change in the depreciation schedule on that. Reagan always wanted to protect the central feature of his tax policy, which was income tax rates. And that, of course, was the main object of liberals, was to roll back the income tax rate cuts. And here and there, Reagan would make other concessions to political reality. One of the things that we forget now is how often Reagan had to fight against trade protectionist instincts in both parties, in both terms. He was always fighting off trade bills, to which, as I say, lots of Republicans were willing to sign on to. And he agreed at one point early in his administration to impose quote-unquote voluntary auto import restraints on Japanese automakers, which is completely indefensible for any advocate of free trade. On the other hand, it was probably politically necessary. If we hadn't diplomatically reached that agreement with the Japanese, Congress would have likely tied their hands and done something worse. Those are the kind of practical compromises people have to make. But I also think that when you look at, you go from there to foreign policy, and the liberal narrative about Reagan and foreign policy is, well, there was the Reagan of the first term, who was the Reagan of the evil empire. And there was the Reagan of the second term, who finally, in his closing months in office in Moscow, says, oh, I don't believe the evil empire anymore, that was another time, another place. And is starting to reach agreements with the Soviet Union. So the argument is that was a whole different Reagan in the second term. And my argument is in fact, you could see the whole Reagan from the very beginning. And on some of these questions of taxes, but also the way he dealt with the Soviet Union, he reminds me of that refraction on the problem of consistency in politics that Winston Churchill wrote about back in the 20s. If you don't know the passage, I'll share it with you. It's a little long, but it's worth going through the whole of it. Churchill wrote, "A statesman in contact with the moving current of events and anxious to keep the ship of state on an even keel and steer a steady course, may lean all his weight now on one side and now on the other. His arguments in each case, when contrasted, can be shown to be not only very different in character, but contradictory in spirit and opposite in direction. Yet his object will throughout have remained the same. His resolves, his wishes, his outlook may have been unchanged. His methods may be verbally irreconcilable. We cannot call this inconsistency. In fact, it may be claimed to be the truest consistency. The only way a man can remain consistent amidst changing circumstances is to change with them while preserving the same dominating purpose." Close quote. Well, if Reagan's dominating purpose in domestic policy was to shrink the size and influence of the federal government, then some of his mid-course corrections can be looked at in a different light. So, for example, one of the things that rankled conservatives then and today was that in 1982, Reagan agreed to a $98 billion tax increase. At that time, that was real money in those days. At that time, it was the largest tax increase in American history. It was $98 billion over 3 years. And the supply siders and others thought Reagan has completely collapsed. He was attacked severely by people like Jack Kemp and others. Except, if you look at this very closely, the whole sequence of events that played out over a whole year, I came to a rather different conclusion about it and a different hypothesis. It's important, I think, to go back and notice that when Reagan came into office, his initial proposal was a 30% cut in income tax rates, starting backdated to January 1st of 1981, the beginning of the calendar year when he came into office. And the revenue projections were that it would result over the next 5 years in a loss of about $350 billion. By the way, it turned out it was never true that the Reagan administration's economic calculators said the tax cut would pay for itself. That was all his outside cheerleaders like Jude Winniski and others who didn't have jobs in it. None of their actual forecasts said the thing will pay for itself right away. They thought in the out years it would start to generate so much more economic growth that it would get back into class black, but not in the early years. Well, what was eventually signed in the end of July was a 25% cut in income tax rates starting October 1st of that year, so a little bit later. Most of what Reagan wanted, but not all of it. And the total 5-year revenue loss projection from the entire package was $700 billion. Because, of course, as it went through Congress over the summer, and the two parties were bidding to win the legislative battle, lots of things got added to the tax bill. That's the way Congress works. And then the news comes to Reagan that we're now going to have huge deficits and the economy's going into recession. And right away people start beating the drums, the Democrats start beating the drums, let's cancel the income tax cut, or at least cancel the third year of it, cancel income tax indexing. And if you remember that Ronald Reagan raised taxes as governor of California, and if you're sitting in his chair, you're thinking to yourself, I think, well, I got twice the tax cut I wanted in dollar terms, a lot of it on special tax breaks for industries, for farmers, for oil industry and so forth that probably don't make economic sense and that I don't want. I think he knew early on that he was going to have to give back some of that tax package, but as I say, wanted to preserve the income tax cut. His opening bid in the fall of 1981 was, I can agree to $3 billion in tax increases, essentially nothing. And at the same time, he quietly authorizes his chief of staff, James Baker, to enter negotiations. But you can also tell from reading his diary and other sources that